Not quite. Oh, we are live, I think. Yes, that's great news. We're here celebrating World Speech Day. My name is Simon Gibson. I'm the founder of World Speech Day. And the purpose of the day, the purpose of World Speech Day, is to celebrate speeches and speech making through live public events around the world. Typically, we have events in around 100, 110 countries. This year, for self-evident reasons, it's less so, it's curtailed. But it has allowed us to explore other ways to use public speaking and speech to reach out, like this live stream. And this next session on live stream is dedicated to rhetoric and the art of public speaking. We've got some terrific contributors from around the world talking about different aspects of rhetoric. I've called it a rhetoric remix because I'm hoping they'll touch on the kind of the ancient art of rhetoric as we've understood it in the Western tradition, but also talking about that in a very 21st century prism, so that we'll get a sense of the arc of rhetoric from tradition to now. The first contributor is Steve Liano from New York City. I'm going to introduce Steve in a mo and put him on the main screen. Steve is there now, I think. It's a little wobbly, the screen, but anyway, that's great.
Yep, I'm here.
And I'm thrilled you can contribute, Steve. Excited to hear your ideas, and please just do a brief introduction, and then we'll catch up on the speech. Are you there, Steve?
Sounds good. So I should just go ahead.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me? Okay, good. I guess I'll just go ahead and get started then. It's good to see everybody. Thank you, Simon. Thanks to everybody joining us for World Speech Day. It's quite an honor to be here. And I am a professor of rhetoric at St. John.
We've lost you, Steve, but maybe that's because you can't hear us. Can you hear us all right? Can you hear us, Steve?
Over the world. And in our current situation with the coronavirus epidemic, when things get very serious, people turn to speech. All of us are glued to our televisions and radios waiting for another broadcast, another update from the government or from the disease control center, and it's speech that we rely on. Public address, traditional public address, as we always have. The technology has changed a little bit, but we're always relying on people saying to us, giving us information, and speaking to us in a way that we can understand and that motivates us. So I wanted to share some principles of rhetoric that are ancient and modern under this idea that we're all looking for information, and most of the information that we're getting is through public address, which is very surprising in a day and age of all incredibly important speech is when things become quite serious. So the first principle I'll share with you in thinking about old rhetoric and new is that rhetoric has always been and will always be about people. A lot of people, they say it's about word choice, it's about semantics, it's about the quality of argument, logic, reason, things like that. But rhetoric at its fundamental heart is about people and relationships. It's about you and approaching a group of people and saying, I think you might have, or what is it that you think we should, what's the biggest problem that faces us? What is it that you think we should do? Rhetoric is always about people, and it's people-centric. So a lot of times in our politics today, people say, well, what we need is more facts. We need better information, more facts, and we need people to understand what the facts and the experts are. But this approach has been failing us precisely because we've forgotten that the purpose of rhetoric, the point of rhetoric, is to promote interaction between people and for people to identify with each other and commune with each other. In fact, the word communication has the word commune in it as a Latin root. So that's the first principle. It's about people primarily and about human beings primarily interacting. So secondly, then, the second principle that I derive from this is that rhetoric requires that you have a understanding of who it is that you're talking to. So a lot of people will teach this, or a lot of the assumptions about public speaking is you have to have the good information first, superior information first, great research first. But I would say at least as important as that is you have to have an understanding of your audience and who it is that you're speaking to. Who's the audience? What are they about? But it goes a bit deeper than that. We can look to the world of algorithms and tracking on the internet and these controversial things about data points and how much am I giving away about my habits to major corporations and to information services who advertise to me through shopping and this and that. And that's one way of understanding the audience. But the more classical way of understanding the audience, the way the ancient Greeks or the Romans and the Western rhetorical tradition would have thought about it, is who does my audience imagine themselves to be? Who does my audience see themselves as? What is it that they think that they are all about? And that's the much, 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 much more important thing than the way our audience actually functions. Because even all that data about shopping or clicking on websites and stuff, people are looking at themselves as they imagine themselves to be. We all have a story that we tell ourselves about who we are and what kind of society we live in and what part of society we're a part of and that we experience and participate in. We all tell a story to ourselves. So this is incredibly important for the rhetorician if you want to motivate people to change their ways or to do something different that they've never thought about before. This is an incredibly important thing to research, is not only who my audience actually is, but who do they imagine themselves to be? And that requires the study of traditions, culture, language, food, music. The rhetorician has to know a lot of different things to be successful. They have to be familiar with both anthropology and also science and also medicine and how people receive medicine and how people receive science in different cultures and different parts of the world, depending on who your audience is. We normally focus on a speech topic and we say, if I get my topic good and I have good research, I'm good to go, and they'll get it. But if I present it in a way that they're not accustomed to, it might be unintelligible to them. A really important part of rhetoric is making your speech intelligible. That is, not just being able to be comfortably heard or loud enough, but to speak in a way that they recognize as important and valuable, with your cultural and emotional and traditional sensibilities. You can't really look those up mathematically and determine what it means to be valuable. Every culture and every group, every subculture, every group of people in a country have a different understanding of value. And it's connected to who they imagine they are and what story they're telling about themselves to themselves and to each other. So the final assumption, before I get into a handy tip here in the bottom of my remarks here, is that the audience is the proper subject of rhetoric, nothing else. And the reason I say that, and the reason that might be kind of shocking to people, is I think we operate under the idea that good information is going to save us, and that facts are going to save us, and that reason and logic are going to save us. But all of these things are not working the way we imagine that they should. In fact, we could say that these are the narratives that we tell ourselves about what we prefer. So to bring up a funny kind of example about this, with the coronavirus scare here in the United States, it's impossible to buy toilet rolls, or toilet paper as we call it. You can't find them anywhere. Everyone's sold out. And on the internet, on social media, people are making fun of this endlessly. But people are contradictory beings. Human beings are very contradictory. The same people making fun of the ridiculousness of this are also the same people who are hoarding toilet rolls. And they see no contradiction in this, because what other people should do is appropriate for them, but I'm the exception. Maybe this is a very particularly American thing. I don't know. But I feel like there's some global crossover of this. It's like, it's okay for me to do it, but everyone else should do it. For example, the governor of New York just announced about 15 minutes ago that all bars, movie theaters, gyms, and restaurants will close at 8 p.m. tonight, because people believe that there should be a quarantine for the virus, but it doesn't apply to them. I'm healthy. I'm not going to get sick. It's fine for me to go out and have a drink with my friends, but everyone else should stay inside. So this is a fundamental understanding. People are inconsistent. Let's look to a more scientific sensibility for this instead of maybe that anecdotal one isn't good enough for you. Let's look to evolutionary psychology and cognitive psychology and what's coming out of the research in these fields about how people think and behave. Well, people are very, very, very bad at reasoning. People are very, very bad at logic. Any psychological experiment can tell you that. Any psychological study can tell you that. But what's really interesting about it is how most people believe that reason and logic are evolutionary traits, or there's something natural about those in human beings. Evolutionary and cognitive psychologists are telling us that these are useful concepts from an evolutionary or developmental standpoint, but they are highly unlikely. And the reason why is because people differ so much by accidental characteristics in how well they can reason and how well they can use logic, that it actually makes more scientific sense to place reason and logic in the realm of communication. That is, we developed reason and logic because we like to persuade each other, not because they're persuasive on their own. We developed them as ways of speaking that allow us different flavors of enjoying one of our favorite treats, talking to one another and trying to get people to see the world our way. This is really insightful stuff. If you want more on that, you can read the work of Dan Sperber and Hugo Mercier, who put out an amazing book about 2 or 3 years ago called The Enigma of Reason. And this is an incredibly fascinating tale of how we got to where we were and believing that reason and logic are going to save us. So if that's not going to do it, if I present excellent facts, my audience can say, oh, yeah, okay, that's good, but doesn't apply to me. How do we get around this? Well, it turns out there's actually quite a useful theory for all the rhetoricians out there who want to practice persuading one another and speaking to one another and trying to get people to get ideas across. And I have my ancient copy of it here. It's Chaim Perlman and Lucy Albrecht-Titica's book, The New Rhetoric. If you read French, I highly recommend it in French, but I do not read French. As a poorly educated American, I speak English okay, and I speak American fairly well. But mostly I'm learning the new language of my students, which is memes, which is a whole rhetorical speech all on its own. But in The New Rhetoric, Perlman and Albrecht-Titica are trying to solve a huge problem, which is how do we get good ideas across to people when they don't accept good ideas unless they are rooted in sort of terms of emotion and personal evaluation and narrative. It's very messy. But one of the things they noticed when they're thinking about audience is that if you're writing a paper, an essay, a blog post, or book, you already are addressing an audience. What are the implicit ways you're addressing that audience? Well, they're actually quite nice. You address the audience as very calm, reasonable people who can step outside of their own views for a few minutes to entertain a new idea. And they call this model the universal audience, not because everyone is like this, but because when we sit down to write, we often write to an audience that has incredibly good characteristics of thought, critical thinking, and things like that. And that's very telling. When you see that as a universal thing across different languages, different kinds of writing, whether it's philosophical or whether it's political, the examples they give are pretty good. But you're always writing as if someone encountered it, they would be able to suspend their own belief and engage it. And I think this is very optimistic. I think what it shows us is as rhetors, we have choices. We have the choice to stoop to the lowest common denominator of our audience and use what would work. We would call that pandering. And this is something that universally throughout rhetoric and through philosophy has been decried. In fact, this is the critique that Aristotle makes of the sophists of ancient Athens. And of course, Plato has nothing good to say about the sophists. But the sophists, in terms of pandering, there's another way to look at them in terms of universal audience, which is they are speaking in a way that they think works for people. They are speaking in a way that they think their audience will rise to the occasion of being the kind of thinker they imagine them to be. So we don't want to pander, but we do want to account for our audience and how they imagine themselves to be. So what can we do? Well, we can speak in the way to raise the audience to the level of thinking and reasoning that we feel is good. We can encourage our audience to be critical thinkers by speaking to them as if they already were and making our speech attractive in that way and speaking to their desires as if they already know and they are already quite sharp. And if you take this into account, this universal audience theory and this idea of raising the bar a bit in the way you speak and not trying to pander or lower or dumb down your speech, you can see varying ways of doing this through the national addresses of our governments across the world in terms of the coronavirus epidemic. There are many health officers in the United States who are speaking in this kind of universal audience way of that we all sort of understand the need to be healthy. And we all understand the risks of health and things like that. And they're not dumbing it down at all. But at the same time, just telling people that they need to stay home because it's the right thing to do is not going to be persuasive enough. We need to speak in a way that takes into account their narrative, their beliefs, and things like that. So the final thought is most of the time when we're going to speak and we're going to address people and we're going to try to be persuasive, we think we're asking them to make a 180. Our assumption of the audience is, oh, they're not going to want to do this. They're going to be against it. But if we think in terms of universal audience, that is, I'm going to address them as reasonable people where we have lots of shared value, lots of shared cultural ideals. Aristotle called this the epideictic mode of speaking, the speech about values. So like on your country's national Independence Day. There are all kinds of epidictic speeches that the government will give. And on different kinds of days, like Armistice Day, for example, leaders of the government will give very somber speeches about what we value and who we are as a people and how we'll never forget this and all these kind of things. The epidictic is a very powerful resource for persuasive argument because it constitutes us as being on the same page. So I could walk into a persuasive situation and think, oh my gosh, I have to turn them 180 degrees around. Well, this is a failing way to approach it. Think in terms of universal audience. What are the principles and values that you're already on board with? Chances are most persuasive acts are maybe a 30 degree pivot, not a 180, maybe a 20 to 30 degree pivot. And the more you have in common with that audience when you speak, the better off they'll be to make the kind of decision you want if you constitute them as thinking and caring people who share a set of values and a set of perspectives on the world that matters and that's important. Then your persuasive task will be much limited. And you'll also be doing a huge service to that audience by constituting them as thinking and feeling people. So that's pretty much what I wanted to share today. I will leave you with one final thought. Ralph Ellison, the famous American author of Invisible Man, wrote an essay in the early 1970s called The Man Behind the Stove at Chehaw Station, where he discussed audience. And he had something I thought was very powerful to say, is that most people approach an audience thinking that they know that they're going to get. It's a mechanical operation. They approach the audience like a jukebox or like a vending machine. Oh, there's the chocolate bar I want. I'll invest, I'll push the right buttons, and I'll get what I want. And this vending machine approach is incredibly detrimental. You can't think of your audience as a mechanical operation. You have to think of them as also sort of fellow rhetors. And instead of a mechanical relationship, you can think of one that's maybe more like a co-conspirator, is what I always say. We're in this together. We're in this persuasive moment together. So that's what I wanted to share. I think audience is the subject of rhetoric, and I'll be happy to take any questions people might have or any discussion that might come from those remarks.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much, Simon.
That's a tour de force, Steve. No less than we expected, but it's always nice to be proved right. So I'm thrilled that you've been able to come on board. Quite a lot of the discussion actually today has been about audience. We had Mette Sergesen from Denmark this morning talking about creating an audience, and her observation that the Prime Minister of Denmark in recent times has talked about the need for good citizenship, and that the way she has positioned the whole coronavirus thing is that it's an act of good citizenship to isolate, in the sense that who doesn't want to be a good citizen? If you're trying to appeal to belief and the belief of an audience, then positioning it as good citizenship is quite a neat way to try and tap into that sense of identity. So a lot of what she said timed and was, interestingly coincidental with yours. I'm also fascinated about the notion of how you create an audience, because it's easy to stand and in front of 200 people and think that those 200 people are an audience, but they're not. They are 200 people. How do you go about creating an audience that thinks, responds, has this magic, a communication almost between itself? We see that in the great, the great rallies where you can sense something different is taking place. It's not about speech; it's about the audience. How do we create audiences?
Boy, that's such a rich question. I'll say a couple of things. First of all, the American rhetorician Kenneth Burke had huge trouble with this in the 1950s. He was a very, very avowed communist, and he went to the American Communist Party meetings in the middle of McCarthy and said, look, we can't be calling Americans workers. No one wants to be a worker. We have to think of another word for this. And they said, well, you're a heathen. You're not a Leninist. You're kicked out of this. So in his efforts of trying to create a better audience got him blacklisted from both the Communist Party and the McCarthy hearings at the same time. So that's a neat trick. Only a rhetorician could perform such a great magic trick. I would say, how do you create an audience? James Crosswhite from the University of Oregon wrote a fantastic book several years ago called The Realm of Reason. And in this book, he challenges this notion of audience as a temporary state. He says, most of the time we are audienced. It's a verb. It's happening to us. As we walk around in our lives, we're hearing snippets of conversation. We're seeing billboards and advertisements. We're catching radio broadcasts out of open windowed bars and things like this. So we're being audienced all the time. So the question is, how does one access the different pulls on attention that people are facing? A lot of times we have a formal event, like a formal speech, and people are coming because they're interested in the topic that you're supposed to be speaking about. They're coming in, but they're atomized. They're bouncing everywhere. We can look to David Bohm, the famous Nobel Prize winning physicist. Later in his career, he took up an interest in communication. He wrote several books on dialogue after he had stopped working on lasers, which he won the Nobel Prize for. And he said, when people get together, they're like photons. They bounce around everywhere, and they might even be in two places at the same time. They're very random. But if you can focus them as a laser, you can cut through any material if you focus them the right way. The question is, how do we do that? And he thought dialogue was the way of doing that. Getting people to share their ideas and feelings and hopes and their perspective might have people finding common ground with one another better. My advice is, when people come in and they want to hear the topic, you have no idea why they want to hear it. Our assumption is, oh, they're opposed to me. But this is the most thin conception you could have. They might also be coming because someone they're interested in romantically is coming, and they want to spend some time with them and show them, hey, I like this too. That's on the extreme edges. So one of the things to do, very first thing to do, is to constitute them as the audience you would like them to be. Why are we here? What brings us together tonight?
Yes.
It's shared values, like citizenship. I think that's a great term. It can mean a lot of different things, but for people interested in the rhetoric of citizenship, I highly recommend Plato's dialogue, Protagoras, because Protagoras is having a debate with Socrates about this very word, and the rhetorical understanding of it versus the philosophical or Socratic understanding of it, quite a bit different. What is citizenship? An ability to adapt, an ability to come together in times of crisis, an ability to find and change new values and new practices. That's Protagoras' sense. But for Socrates, it's something much deeper and more permanent. And I think that this more fungible one is the one that we need in times of great global emergency. And so it's a great term to be exploring at this.
Yeah, well, I'll just have one final little thing, which is on that notion of citizenship. I increasingly get the feeling that public speaking is part of citizenship. That it isn't a right, but that it's a driver.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
No,
I don't mean to cut you off there.
do.
If you had more to say. No, okay. Yeah, I think we can look to the. I think the if you're interested in that, public speaking is a way of embodying citizenship. So there are theories of rhetoric that we become ourselves when we're speaking. We become who we are through speech. We express ourselves, and oftentimes you can experience this when you're talking to someone or you're giving a talk and you're like, wow, that was pretty good. Who said that? And you realize you're sort of watching yourself speaking. Athletes call this being in the zone. This idea that we're not really who we are unless we're articulating. We're articulating beings, and articulated beings is a very powerful notion. And in fact, you look to the educational systems of ancient Rome, and that's all they taught. For the wealthy Romans, the Romans of a certain class, all they're teaching them is how to speak to one another about incredibly important and uncertain legal and political issues. And that's what education is can you access the various values and things to constitute yourself as a Roman figure of authority? Quintilian famously says, always speak in front of a crowd so that they imagine a Roman legion is going to march up behind you at the end of every point. So this kind of authoritative, connected, emotional kind of speech that's connected to one's culture and one's citizenry is incredibly important. I think we can just look to, all eyes who are interested in this should look to the UK, because I think the UK are leaders on this with the increasing demand for oralcy as a competency in public schooling. I think that's so exciting to me. Here in the United States, we've thrown public money since the 19th century after speech and debate programs as kind of an extracurricular thing, but it's still not a core competency in public education in most states in the United States to show an oral component. But in higher ed, oral exams are coming back, and I think the UK has many organizations, from the English Speaking Union to other private organizations, working on oralcy and trying to get that into all the schools as a core educational component. And I think that's the place where the best innovation on that question is happening.
Well, thanks, Steve. One of the contributors earlier was Dr. Tom Wright, who heads up Speaking Citizens and the Oracy Project in the UK. So I'd really be fascinated to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm going to move on to Dr. Alam now. I'm so thrilled to have had you as a contributor, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I might hang out for a minute if that's okay. I don't know if I need to leave immediately.
Switch mode to Dr. Alam, and she's got her microphone turned off at the moment, but if she has her mic turned on, then we can hear her.
Can you hear me?
Oh, okay, great. So I'm thrilled to have you on, Dr. Alam, from Dar Al Hekma University in Saudi Arabia, and I'm reliably informed you're going to be talking on Arab rhetoric among women and its tradition in the female society. So it's a great pleasure to have you, and I'm just going to leave you to continue the introduction and then talk about Arab rhetoric in women's society.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you, Simon. And it's an honor to have me on World Speech Day 2020. Thank you very much for this. Today, I'm going to speak about the tradition of rhetoric among Arab women, in particular about ancient literary female salons. When people talk today about women's literary salons, they actually often refer to the pioneering women who are believed to have started this refined tradition in Paris in the 17th century, 17e siècle. These women were called les grandes dames de salon parisien. But little do we know that the tradition goes back to hundreds of years before that and to thousands of kilometers away from the City of Light. For in the heart of the Arabian deserts, women from ancient times, at least from the 7th century CE, met with literary figures, men and women, in designated places and times to engage in enthusiastic discussions about what Arabs believed they excelled at, which is the art of rhetoric. So while the word salon itself has European etymology, the concept of a literary gathering has been part of Arabic tradition for centuries. Arabs call these gatherings nadwas or muntadas from the verb nada, which literally means a call for a meeting or a gathering for a specific purpose. Another word in Arabic is majlis, and majlis has a more regular or permanent nature in terms of time and space. But if we go back in history to the Arab world, we will see that the first literary salons took place outside en plein air, as they say, with the first Arab female poet that I'll be discussing today. Her name is Al-Khansa, and Al-Khansa lived in the 7th century CE, a canonical poet that if you ask any learner of Arabic literature today about the first name that comes to mind when speaking about ancient Arab women poets, it's almost guaranteed to be Al-Khansa. Al-Khansa Salon had no walls, as I said, for it took place in a marketplace called Souq Hawkaz. Souq Hawkaz was a traditional meeting point for poets in Al-Jahiliyyah era before Islam. Literally elite met in this market, which ran for about 20 days. Since Arabs followed the lunar calendar, the first signs of the crescent of the month of the Qa'dah kind of indicated the beginning of this market, and it ran for 20 days. Souq Hawkaz was a fascinating venue where people gathered to buy and sell merchandise like honey, dates, spices, textile, perfumes, and cattle. But most important to us today is the literary aspect of this market. It was a location where poets met and literary competitions were held. Orators, critics, and poets of all genres gathered in an open forum. And in this space, in Hawkaz, Al-Khansa's name starred. She recited her poetry and was appointed as a judge between different poets to select the most eloquent poems. The articulateness of her poems, mostly elegies to her dead brothers, Sakhar and Muawiyah, won her literary status, unprecedented to women of her time. Al-Khansa converted to Islam, and actually she met with Prophet Muhammad, who valued her poetry. He asked her to recite it to him time and again in public as a recognition of its distinction. This stands as a proof that Islam doesn't prohibit women's rhetorical engagement in the public sphere. The harsh life of the desert, in addition to her tragic losses of 2 brothers and 4 sons in battle, tinted her poetry with tones of melancholy. And her poems are actually rich with images of pathetic fallacy, faith, and endurance. And if we move from the 7th century CE to the 8th century CE, we will meet another prominent lady who held another literary salon. Her name was Sukaina bint al-Hussein. Sukaina was the first hostess of an Arab literary salon in its proper sense. Her salon was called Majlis, and it fits all the criteria of the traditional literary salon in terms of a fixed place, time, and scope of topics discussed. If we contextualize the salon in time and place, we will find that historically it is during the early years of the Islamic Golden Age, which ran from the 8th to the 14th century, a flourishing period of advancement in literature, art, science, and so on. Geographically, her salon was set in Al-Madinah al-Munawwara, which is the second of the holiest cities in Islam. Not only the space was sanctified, but Sukaina herself had an important religious lineage, being the great-granddaughter of Prophet Muhammad. This connection to the Prophet is quite important, as it testifies that art and Islam can actually go hand in hand. Actually, the Quran itself is a rhetorical piece. It was usually read and transmitted by word of mouth before it was written down. The word Quran itself comes from the verb iqra, which was the first order given to Muhammad, which centralizes the importance of rhetoric in the lives of Muslims. The Quran unequivocally influenced rhetorical excellence with the eloquence of its diction, the different levels of register, the rhythmic and musical nature to its verses, and also the narrative quality of its discourse. Now back to Sukaina. Sukaina was the first woman in the history of Islam to open her salon to male and female guests. She organized evening of poetry, music, and literary criticism. Discussions diverted to so many different areas like history, theological rhetoric, religious polemics, mysticism, and more. Iconic poets like Jarir al-Farazdaq, Jamil Buthaina, and many others populated her salon. Sukaina was a highly regarded woman, intelligent, imposing, and very presentable with a high sense of fashion of her time. She wrote moving elegies to her father, who was killed in the Battle of Karbala, and she excelled in political poetry and literary criticism. Because of her religious status, Sukaina used to sit behind a barrier, but had male poets seated in her salon, where she could see them, but they could not see her. They communicated through speech. And if we take a leap in time and space, we will move to Cordoba in the 11th century to meet another lady who hosted a very famous literary salon. Her name is Al-Wallada bint al-Mustakfi, or Wallada. Wallada was a princess and a poet. Her father was Al-Mustakfi Billah, or Muhammad III. He was one of the last caliphs in the Umayyad dynasty in Cordoba. Wallada was a bright woman, cultured, refined, and extremely beautiful. in history, she's remembered as a controversial figure. She actually crossed many boundaries. She composed daring poetry. She went out in public without a veil. She wore transparent garments embroidered with her poetry. And of course, she was fiercely attacked by religious men. But in fact, Walada was a person with high ethical values. As her father had no male heirs, Walada inherited his property and transformed one of his palaces into a school in Cordoba. There, she offered classes of reading, writing, music, and poetry, and the arts of love to women of all classes, from those of noble birth to slaves purchased by Walada herself. She also established a famous literary salon that gained glamorous fame in Cordoba. There, she hosted eminent literary figures and organized poetical competitions. The renowned poet Ibn Zaydoun was one of her regular attendees, and he fell in love with her. And to him, she wrote outstanding poetry, some of which still survives until this very day. Besides these three women, there are many other women from different times and places all over the Arab world who hosted literary salons. But for today, I think I'm going to stop here, and I hope that this short summary of these three poets from ancient Arabic literature was informative, and I hope that every time the salonières are mentioned, we remember that long time ago in the deserts of Arabia, open-air literary gathering existed where women excelled in the art of rhetoric. Thank you very much for being here with me today.
Dr. Lam, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. And it was a wonderful evocation of the kind of origin of rhetoric.
Thank you very much for being here today with me and for hosting me on World Speech Day.
Fantastic, fantastic. A wonderful evocation of the beginnings of rhetoric in open-sided tents in the desert, where, of course, the words and persuasion and speech were the gift of life, really. So it really brought it home to me that there is another tradition, another way of starting that we often forget. So thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for hosting me.
And I'm now going to move over to Dennis. Thank you so much. We'll see you again soon, Dr. Alam. Thank you very much. Thank
you very much. Have a wonderful continuation of the day.
Well, I hope that was inspiration, Dennis. I certainly found it so. Can you hear me all right? Is the volumes all right?
I hear you fine. Do you hear me fine?
It may be you need to get a little bit closer to the mic. I don't know.
Maybe we should try these. Let's see if
it makes
any difference for us, Simon.
Yep. It's a little quiet, but we can live with it if we can't. Yep.
I'm sure this is going to be better. Yes?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. That's
great. Of course. Technology.
That's great. Absolutely. It always works in the end. We've had a few hiccups during the day with technology, but it's interesting. It's really interesting, this exercise of trying out live streaming as a way to talk about public speaking, because the two interact rather well. And I'm finding it fascinating, partly because of the kind of wonderful contributions that are being made, but also because there's such a kind of rich interaction between the technology and what we're talking about, and the new ways in which the current crisis is forcing us to use this technology to approach public speaking.
Yeah.
Anyway, I won't go on myself. I'll just introduce you, Dennis. Dennis Becker, Dr. Dennis Becker. I like to think of as a sort of doyen of public speaking coaches in the US. A great mentor and the founder of the Speech Improvement Company, which I believe has been going for over 50 years. And it's a great pleasure to have you here, Dennis, and for us to learn from the master about rhetoric and public speaking. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Simon, for those kind words. And thank you, the rest of you who are joining us today, and welcome to World Speech Day. World Speech Day this year, March 16, in the year 2020, as we all know, has presented us with an incredible problem, a health problem around the world. And all of us are now communicating much more with technology and online and all sorts of things because of the so-called coronavirus, which we're all dealing with. So thank you for joining us electronically, online like this. I appreciate it. Now, I want to talk about something that's very contemporary. And I want to talk about something that's very applicable to you, every single person who is listening today. Some of the presentations I've heard this morning are academic, and this last one about Saudi Arabia, about Arabia and the women, has been wonderfully exciting. I like it as a rhetorician. I enjoy it. But I want to talk about something that means something to you every single day. And as you saw, perhaps the title of our presentation today is Aristotle's Classical Rhetoric, the Patterns of Reasoning. I wish I could say I created this, but it came to us from Aristotle almost 3,000 years ago, and it hasn't been changed since. Why? Because it's an understanding of how the normal human brain works. Normal human brains, when they think things through, when we patternize and think things through and logic things through, we use two systems. Aristotle introduced those to us almost 3,000 years ago in 3 books. Well, actually, they weren't books. I mean, we think about them as books today, but we think about as the 3 books of rhetoric were actually collections of his notes from the teachings that he was doing. Aristotle was a philosopher and a teacher. In the second book, second collection, called the Rhetorica, he introduces something called logos, Logos, meaning logic. And in that book, in those series of lectures, he talks about how the human brain logics things through. How do we think about things? How do we make decisions? And ultimately, how do we then speak with other people? That's what I want to talk about today with us for a little bit, because it applies every single day to every single person on the planet. I don't care what age you are. I don't care what gender you are. I don't care what country you come from. I don't care what education level you have. I don't care what culture you have. If you have a normal brain, you do one of these 2 things. And I want to share them with you today so that by knowing them and knowing perhaps what your preference is in the way that you speak and communicate with others, you can also understand how other people think and communicate with others. And that's you. So let's talk about it. Now, I want to use 2 words that perhaps you've heard before, but we'll put them in a very clear way so that we can talk about what they mean to you. Aristotle introduced to us 2 patterns of reasoning. One he called inductive, and the other he called deductive. Now, I know you've heard these words before. Let's clarify what they mean. If you are a person who likes to speak, to think about, to reason things through, and to present your ideas inductively, you are a person who says, look, because of this, and because of this, and because of this, I think we should do this. The way you think, because, conclusion. If you are a person who thinks and communicates deductively, you say, well, I think we should do this. And I think we should do it because. Notice that? Complete opposite. Inductive says this. Here's what I think. Deductive says, well, I think this because of this, and this. Now, the interesting thing here is that both of them are right. Both of them are very effective. Both of them are very powerful. Now, I want to point out also that we're not talking about in your brain. We're not talking about left brain, right brain, that hemisphere thing. No. Inductive and deductive patterns of reasoning fit both left brain and right brain people. So it's not that. Now, you have a preference. We all do. I have a preference. Everyone listening to us today has a preference. We prefer to think and communicate either inductively or deductively, and both of them are right. The difficulty in communication, the difficulty in human relationships comes when 2 people are different. Inductive people trying to talk to deductive people, this can happen. Or worse, this can happen. And what we want to have happen, of course, is this: a nice, comfortable relationship and communication. But it doesn't happen. These 2 things are completely opposite. Remember, they're both right. They're both powerful, both effective, and they're both used every single day. So I want to ask you a question. With this brief introduction, inductive, because, conclusion. Deductive, conclusion, because. With these two different things, I want to ask you a question. I'm going to stop speaking for 8 seconds. And I want you to think about, which do you tend to be? Do you tend to be more of an inductive thinker and speaker or a deductive thinker and speaker? I'm going to stop talking for 8 seconds. Think about yourself for a second. I'm going to ask you. Okay. Now, whichever you decided you are, it's right. It's your tendency, your preponderance of communication tends to be either inductive or deductive. Okay. How do you know? I bet as I'm describing this, you can already think about people who are, let's say you're inductive. You can already think about people who are deductive, who just blare things out and just talk like this and they don't give you any background. When you want a lot of information, you want the details. If you're a deductive person and you're listening to an inductive person speak, you really get frustrated. Get to the point. Come on, I don't need the detail. Get to the point. What are you talking about? It's different. It's opposite, and very frustrating for inductive and deductive people to talk to one another. So, okay, if it's normal and natural, why do we care about it? Because we care about building positive relationships. That's why. Because we care about being heard. We care about people appreciating who we are, what we think. Sometimes we care about persuading people, educating them, helping them to really clearly agree with us. That's when inductive and deductive make a huge difference. Now, for example, I know that I'm an inductive person. It's just the professor in me and the teachings and all of that stuff. I know I'm an inductive person. So I know that if I'm speaking with a deductive person, I have to be very different. My wife and I were married for 52 years. Wonderful. 4 kids, 4 books, worked together every day. She was the most deductive woman I ever knew. But here it is. Our relationship, like a lot of good relationships, were built on a lot of things. This one thing didn't work, didn't mesh for us. So we figured it out. So I knew that when I went to her and I wanted to say something, I would walk in. Her name was Paula. I'd walk in and I'd say, Paula, have you got a minute? And I'd listen. If she said to me, yeah, what's up? I knew I could talk to her inductively. If I went to her and I said, Paula, have you got a minute? And she said, what? I knew I had to get right to the point. she wanted to know. She didn't have time to listen to my inductive thinking. But that's because our relationship was built like this and we wanted it to work. At work, you're not in those kind of relationships. You're not in a loving relationship that wants this to work and figures out how to make it work. That's why at work and in other places where you are not in those familial and loving relationships, it's important for you to know what your tendency is and what's going to be effective and appropriate in the given situation, the setting that you're in. So as coaches, speech improvement company, we do this all the time, every day. We do it with each other. My wife and I were opposites, and yet we still communicated every single day. Our company is the oldest speech coaching firm in the United States. We founded it together, Paula and I. 52 years. The company's now almost 60 years old. You can do this. You need to know what's your tendency, or inductive or deductive. They're both right, remember. But you need to be able to switch, be able to moderate, be able to listen one way, talk another perhaps, because there's some people who are both. You may be one of those. There are some people who like to talk inductively, but when they listen, get to the point. They like to listen deductively. And there are some people, some questions even that you ask, maybe ask deductively, but you want to have a lot of information about it. You want to listen inductively. There's a huge, difference is not the right word. They're opposite, but they're both right. They're both effective. Aristotle gave them both to us. It's up to us to figure out which one is going to be most appropriate in which particular setting or situation. And as I said, it doesn't make any difference what country, what company, what age, education, doesn't make any difference. This is how the normal brain works. So your normal brain needs to, first of all, assess, are you a more inductive kind of a communicator and speaker, or a more deductive kind of communicator and speaker? Both right, both okay, but so different. Once you figure it out, you are then able to figure out how to mesh with the other person, as opposed to constantly missing. What's wrong? I thought I said that. He never gets it. What could be a simple miss like this? I can't tell you how many times I've had couples come into my office. Difficulty communicating, they want some help. I can listen for a few minutes and tell instantly that one is very inductive and one is very deductive. If you can, now there are other things, of course, that people have to agree on. There are other issues. There are certainly feelings and all those other things that come into it. But once you at least know that one of the difficulties is that we're missing each other. We're just missing each other because of the way we process information, the way processing, the way patterning, the way reasoning happens. This is what Aristotle gave us nearly 3,000 years ago. It may be called classical rhetoric to some people, but it is very pragmatic, very immediate to all of us today. And I wanted to share this with you today to give you that to think about. World Speech Day. World Speech Day. Everyone in the world speaks like this. It's a good idea to figure out which one you are. Which are you hearing? How can you mesh with that person a little bit better, more effectively? That's going to make you a much more effective speaker in the world, wherever you are. And it's going to make you a more effective listener. And those are the wonderful things that you can bring to a relationship. Good speaking, good listening, effective communication. Anyway, that's what I wanted to share with you today, Simon. I hope it was helpful. I'm open to any kind of questions that can be helpful to those who are tuned in to us.
Fantastic, Dennis. Thank you very much. That was a wonderfully concise review. I'm just curious, do you think that the deductive person is more emotional and the inductive more reasoning, more logical? Is that in the way that you would approach them? I mean, I just wonder whether they are sort of different in those terms as well.
Yeah, it's a very good question. We often hear that question, and it seems to be, and even the way I talked about it, deductive seems more emotional. Yes, I understand. The direct answer to your question is no. It doesn't make a difference. Both of them can be very emotional, and both of them can speak in the way that they speak with deep emotion. Now, you're asking a question also that attaches to another element of effective speaking. We talked about reasoning, figuring stuff out, but then you have to deliver it. So if I deliver something with more emotion, it doesn't mean I'm more deductive.
Right.
Less emotion doesn't mean I'm just inductive, not at all. So the answer to your question is no, it doesn't make any difference whether it's inductive or deductive, or it's emotional or not emotional. Both can be that way.
Okay, right. I'm interested because I just sort of sense that in speech making that one's often really playing to the emotions as much as the logos, and certainly when you get large crowd situations, it's that emotional response that the speaker pulls upon and tries to draw out. So that's a fascinating world.
Well, you brought another word in here, and I wanted to go just a step further, if I may. Something else that Aristotle gave us. May I go a little beyond patterns of reasoning, Simon?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Because you mentioned the word emotion, and I mentioned the word logic. Aristotle gave us something else, which is very powerful, also pervasive worldwide. He said that when you are attempting to be persuasive with someone, that there are 3 ways to do that. One is called logos, the one we talked about.
Yeah.
That's inductive and deductive reasoning. One is called pathos, which is the use of emotion. You can persuade people by touching them emotionally. And there's a third one called ethos. Ethos is the attempt to persuade people by your character, who you are, the reputation you have. Oh, Bob said that? It's okay. Whatever Bob says. Somehow Bob, in that case, has ethos. He has credibility. So sometimes we can persuade people because they know who we are, and sometimes we have to use a little bit of emotion of some sort, and other times we need to use logic. So if you combine inductive and deductive with ethos, pathos, and logos, now we're getting to the question that you asked. There is a blend of those kinds of things. You put them together, and the delivery then makes all the difference. When we get into delivery, now we're talking about speed and volume and facial expression and gestures, all of that kind of stuff. But inductive and deductive, and ethos, pathos, and logos are two of the most powerful things that Aristotle gave us most 3,000 years ago, and there has not been a bit of improvement in them since that time.
It's fascinating, isn't it? It is fascinating that, as you say, 5th century BC Athens, they were inventing a pattern of persuasion that we still hold today.
No question. And we see it everywhere.
Yeah, we do. Thank you so much, Dennis. That was fantastic. I'm so pleased to have had you take part. It was a great support of yours for World Speech Day, and thank you so much. Stick around. I'm going to involve Gideon in a moment, but thank you very, very much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much Simon for inviting me, and the rest of you take care of yourself out there. Till we meet again next time. I am Dr. Dennis Becker. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Thank you. And I think now we're going to Gideon. Hello, Gideon.
Hello.
Well, the sounds and all those sort of things are all right?
Sounds good to me. Can you hear me fine?
Yep. Well, it's great to have you on board, Gideon, from Brigham Young University. So I guess it's early morning rather than late afternoon with you, but as another sort of fascinating element of all of this is the kind of time zone thing that virtual presentations bring into it, that we traverse time and space. But thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to leave you to do a bit of an introduction and then cover your discussions on rhetoric in the kind of digital society and the way that speech and rhetoric is influenced, but also influences digital society.
Very good. Thank you, Simon. I'm glad to be part of World Speech Day today. It was a very exciting opportunity, and especially given the current circumstances with the pandemic, it only underscores the importance of us not just turning to the digital, but also turning to public address, as Steve talked about earlier. So this is very timely, and thanks, Simon, for organizing this. By way of introduction, I'm Gideon Burton from Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. And my claim to fame with respect to rhetoric is in 1996, I put up a website called Silva Rhetoricae, the Forest of Rhetoric. It's kind of a primer on rhetorical terminology. And what I put up as essentially a guidebook for my students ended up becoming a rather well-known website. And now I've had some 18 million unique visitors and over a century of visitor time logged on the site.
Wow.
And that has been astounding to me and helps me change my thinking about when we put content online and just the breadth of audiences that we have and the reach globally and over time. So obviously, as we're talking about audiences and rhetoric, and we enter the digital realm, we have a whole lot of things to think about with respect to whom we're speaking to, especially when we have recorded events like this one, where we are speaking to a few people at the present, but probably a lot more in the future. I teach rhetoric and civilization. I talk with people about history and how public speaking and study of rhetoric has influenced our society over time. And I always like to begin with in 5th century Athens and talk about the sophists and their instructions in rhetoric and so on. And I like to quote Isocrates, and I'd like to give you this brief paragraph where he talks about the importance of public speaking to society. Because there has been implanted in us the power to persuade each other and to make clear to each other whatever we desire, not only have we escaped the life of wild beasts, but we have come together and founded cities and made laws and invented arts. And generally speaking, there is no institution devised by man which the power of speech has not helped us to establish. Now, this is something that would be carried forward. This concept of building things together would be carried forward in the Enlightenment with the rise of democracies, especially in the West. And there we have this idea that you cannot have a participating citizenry unless they have means of communication by which they can both understand what's going on in their world, but also then be part of that. And that was chiefly conceived of in terms of public speaking, although then we have the world of the printed word, particularly the popular press, But even so, we have retained this idea of freedom of speech being tied to democracy. And although freedom of speech ends up applying to all kinds of other contexts, it still has that baseline meaning in public address. So I'm thinking a lot about that nowadays, because we seem to be under threat of the virtues of public speaking, and what has normally been this binding force within societies, particularly democracies, is now partly enhanced, but partly challenged by the digital realm. So I do a lot of thinking about how can we rediscover the importance of eloquence and persuasion and public address for the digital age. And just to deepen the problem a little bit, it wasn't the rise of the internet that began to make problematic the uses of public speaking. If we look at the rise of mass communication in the 20th century, I think about radio and television and some degree cinema. These become a kind of top-down media experience for the masses, where it's essentially this monologue coming from centralized organizations or companies, and there's very little talking back that happens as far as that goes. And then, as some cultural critics have pointed out, I'm thinking in particular of Neil Postman, and he preceded the digital age, if we define that loosely, as the 21st century, but he was critical of the electronic age, so he's thinking more in terms of mass media. And he opined and complained that the nature of public discourse in the 20th century had been compromised and was much less than it was in the 19th century, and this is due to the passive consumption of that we're conditioned into by way of the mass media. And also that our attention gets divided, and also that the things that are communicated tend to be advertisements and entertainment, and that novelties were taking the place of more substantive public discourse. Now, he was idealizing a bit, but there's something to what he says. And when we think about the digital age, it can only make us realize that things may have gotten worse. Even though we have the social media, and it seems like there can be more participation from citizens, we all know that often the social media seem to make things worse in society and bring out the worst in us. And we're constantly battling the issue of fragmentation and multitasking. And so it may make us want to think back to the good old days when people were willing to entertain an idea for longer than a few seconds. It seems that we've had a loss of substantive long-term discourse. And so perhaps a return to some kind of public speaking would be to our benefit. And I agree in part with this, although I'm reluctant both to simplify an idealization of the past or to simplify the despair of the present. And I think that maybe democracy and public speaking wasn't always the ideal that it's said to be in the past. And I don't think that the way that the media has taken us today is necessarily always taking us down to the worst common denominator or the worst uses of human communication. And so I wanted to highlight some of the ways in which I see the return to some of the aspects of public discourse that have been prized in the past and maybe have not been altogether lost to us in the present. So I want to think, for example, about we have today, due to the long tail of content, more and more access to audio recordings and video recordings of important orators from the past. I recently downloaded a book from Audible, which had a collection of speeches from everyone from, let's see, Joan of Arc, Susan B. Anthony, Winston Churchill, Amelia Earhart, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, John F. Kennedy, Lenin, Martin Luther King Jr., lots of variety there. And some of those are actual recordings of live speeches, and others were recreations. And the point is that this is someone who teaches rhetoric and public speaking. It's wonderful that there's so much more access to really substantive, important speaking from the past. You think of how easy it is to bring up, for example, a recording of Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. Anyway, there's that sort of thing, broader availability. Also, even through some of our means of entertainment, we have present to us the power of public speaking. I'm thinking of, for example, when Kenneth Branagh was performing Henry V in his movie, And you have that St. Crispin's Day speech, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. In our cinema, we often turn to these moments of public unity that happens by way of public speaking. And it's kind of a throwback then to idealizing the power of persuasion in public. For example, Mel Gibson playing William Wallace at the Battle of Stirling with his stirring speech about freedom. And of course, there are countless movies where you have locker room speeches, sports movies, Remember the Titans and things like that. Today, we also have more and more speech events like this very one that we're doing, or perhaps more famously, the TED Talks. And that shows you the vitality and the interest in public speaking today, and not just in its live moment, but as it gets disseminated in various ways online. I'm also a real fan of the Moth Radio Hour, which is it mostly is disseminated through a podcast of these live speaking storytelling events, and then it gives you a chance to hear those. It's very not just entertaining, but very engaging kind of content. I'd like to just kind of end by talking about the everyman orator. Today, due to the around 2005, when we started talking about the participatory web, people would say, don't blame the media, become the media. And nowadays, that's even more and more possible as we have things like YouTube and podcasting, where individuals can have their say, but in a long and sustained form, and they can gain an audience and become, or they're capable of interacting and causing good to happen in the world on a level that was not possible before. I teach podcasting, and it's amazing to me how it has enabled students to grow brave to talk about substantive issues that they may not have before. And when suddenly their words, their recorded episodes of their podcasts are circulating, they start to feel that sense of empowerment that public speaking can often give people, as they feel like the dignity of their own, representing their own ideas, combined with being taken seriously by the broadened audiences that are out there. Even when our audiences may be few, like ours today here, we can always anticipate that there will be others who will pick up on this and hear it later, and our words could be disseminated and so on. And I don't think we're done with the golden age of public speaking. We are doing it through a different medium, and there are plenty of challenges to be sure. Things with like our virtual presence and how audiences differ and how we respond to them. But I think we have great reason to remain optimistic that public speaking can be combined with the digital age to do some good. Thanks.
Thank you, Gideon. And that's great. And how do you think that these new, they're not so new, but newish elements of digital communication are affecting public speaking and public speech? Do you think they kind of, are we living in just the Insta society where everything has to be short and clipped, and or how they actually affecting us?
Oh, I think that's a very good point. And one of the great criticisms, and quite accurate criticisms, of the digital age is that our media tends to become more fragmented, and so you can't have any kind of sustained, thoughtful discourse. But I think there's a kind of countercurrent that's going on right now with the rise of longer form media, and we see that perhaps most obviously in terms of like video streaming and movies and so on. But with the rise of podcasting, with some 500,000 podcasts now available over iTunes, of course there's plenty of nonsense, and as the media has been democratized, it brings out all kinds of different things. But what is being proven over and over again, and advertisers are catching on to this as well, is that people are interested in long form content. The rise of both audiobooks and podcasts, I think, is a really good example of that.
Do you think it actually affects the way people speak? You mentioned the "I Have a Dream" speech, and the imagery in that speech is just remarkable. And he talks about curvaceous California, which I've always treasured as an idea. But he was obviously speaking with the knowledge of broadcast. Something in that speech is actually formed by the sense of being broadcast around the United States. There's a sense of geography, of scale. Do you think that was the television and radio influence? Do you think new media is actually affecting any ways that we speak as such? The way our use of visuals and metaphor and that sort of thing. Is there any correlation there?
Oh, indeed. People have different content streams than they used to, and they are thinking more in terms of the visual and in terms of things like memes, as has been discussed before.
Yeah.
I think that sometimes we turn to the visual too much as a crutch. When I teach students about how to do presentations, I will take time to help them learn how to do better visual design and, you know, an improved PowerPoint and things like that. But I also invite them to consider that you can still communicate very effectively without using all that secondary media. So I think it requires calling attention to the fact that we can simplify our uses of the media and still amplify their importance. We do have a lot of currents going in popular culture and online culture that do affect the ways that we communicate. And I think sometimes that's most evident in text with text messaging and text-based commenting online and so on. It'll be interesting to see if we have increased amounts of audio interaction, if that will also make changes. I think about apps like Marco Polo, et cetera, where now we're moving from text messaging to asynchronous video messaging.
Oh, yeah.
I think we will start seeing some new mores evolve.
And into the longer form.
Well, yes, but I think we're going to continue to see a diversification of types of formats. And, you know, we'll be in for some surprises. A lot of the surprises don't always seem to be pleasant ones and seem to be playing to kind of superficial popular culture. But this is part of what I'm trying to get across today is as I start turning my students to looking at the wide range of longer form content, it really does give you hope. One quick example is the, oh, it suddenly slipped my mind. There's a very famous history podcast, and each episode is 3 to 4 hours long.
Yes.
It's extraordinarily popular. And why the name of it? Anyway, there is hope when you see people that are willing to give their sustained attention to this longer form content.
Well, Gideon, thank you so much. That's been wonderful. Thank you for contributing to World Speech Day in such a eloquent and educated way. It's been a real revelation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. A great effort you're doing here.
Going to have Mike come on and take over, but it's been a great pleasure and lovely to talk.
All right.
I'm just going to make you into the presenter, Mike. Hi.
All right, good.
Okay, great. Audio levels all okay?
I can hear you. I hope, do you hear me properly?
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. Yeah.
All right, great.
I'm very, very grateful, Mike, for joining us. Mike's a very renowned speechwriter and commentator on speeches, and so I'm really looking forward to some great insight from Mike on 21st century rhetoric and what we can expect now. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Simon. And Gideon, I have to learn how to present as well in this format as you just presented, because you looked at the camera properly and I am still trying to figure out how to move this. So forgive me, I'm going to be relying on some notes, and I haven't quite mastered the art of reading notes and looking at the camera, but I will do my best. I wanted to talk about rhetoric in healthcare emergencies. I have a background of having been 20 years at Johns Hopkins University, which has one of the premier schools of public health in the world, a fine medical school, and it's a regional center of excellence. It's a great hospital. The issue of communicating health communications in general is extremely complex. It's a difficult challenge. And made all the more so during a health crisis. And believe it or not, we are now in the 21st century. We are in the fourth pandemic of the 21st century. There was SARS in 2003. There was H1N1 in 2009, Ebola in 2014, and now coronavirus in 2019. So this all feels new and uncharted. I would suggest only because of the scale of what we're going through. What I'd like to say is, having had 3 previous experiences in this realm, we're well prepared and we're communicating effectively, and the rhetoric matches the reality on the ground. And of course, I think all of us know that this is not the case at all. So I want to call attention in this brief talk to dichotomies where the rhetoric and the reality do not seem to correspond, and what that is presenting as a challenge, both in practical matters and in sort of larger terms of how we are going to manage to muddle through this crisis, because it does seem that we are on a muddle through mode. You know, one of the issues with health communications in particular, and the rhetoric surrounding health communications, is that it is inherently a difficult subject, because the subject is not we are at war. It is not a Rooseveltian moment that, you know, yesterday was a day of infamy and now we have an enemy and now we know what we need to do. In health communications, the subject matter is frequently diverse and complex. When communities are at risk, you are dealing with large and diverse audiences who are stressed in very particular ways, often stressed because they don't know what's happening. It is an invisible enemy. And in particular, in health crises, there is an abundance of misinformation. So we all know the term snake oil salesman. It's, you know, whenever a health crisis arises, almost as quickly a Jim Baker will appear on the internet trying to sell his silver solution that is going to, you know, cure the coronavirus. Or you will find recommendations on the web that, you know, drinking bleach kills the coronavirus. Something about health crises in particular seems to foster misinformation and causes a special concern. So if we look at, in particular, realizing that in times like this, the primary information source we receive is through the media, and there are intermediary reporters who are trying to figure out what's going on and trying to, you know, take it very seriously, trying to provide their readers with the best and most reliable information. And there's essentially two kinds of rhetorical motifs that develop, and you'll see them now if you start thinking about them. There is the straightforward public health motif, and in this case, what you see is a reliance on sanctioned experts giving us the most scientifically sound information about what we should do in terms of a public health emergency. So right now we are hearing a lot about isolating ourselves, social distancing, washing our hands, things of this nature. But there's a second motif that occurs just as frequently, and I just pulled an article from yesterday. This is a CNN article. The headline was, "Infected people without symptoms might be spreading coronavirus more than we expected." And this falls into a different sort of rhetorical trope. This one is the basic question of the writer is, are we receiving correct information? Are we receiving the full information? Is information being withheld? And the way that this frequently plays out, and it did in this article, was it starts with an example of the CDC website, which is, of course, a sanctioned provider of correct information. Tells us that we are at risk of contracting COVID-19, contracting the disease caused by coronavirus, when we are in the presence of people who are symptomatic, people who are showing symptoms of having the disease. They have fever, they're coughing or sneezing, they're expelling particles. But of course, we're new into this crisis, and that is not an absolutely known scientific fact. That is a presumption on best available evidence. The outbreak in Massachusetts seemed to indicate that there are people who are carrying the disease and spreading the disease who are asymptomatic, or whose symptoms are so so relatively benign that they don't realize they have the disease. So then you get the second kind of, rhetorical trope, which is the concealment of information trope, that the CDC, for instance, it is implied, is not giving us the straight story, that you've been told that you can only contract the disease from someone who is clearly symptomatic. But in fact, there are, your friends and neighbors may be utterly asymptomatic, but they may be spreading the disease. Now, the way this trope tends to play out in the media is, and the CNN article from yesterday is a perfect example. They will say, we contacted the CDC and they declined to respond to information. They'll find a separate expert who will then opine and say, well, this looks a lot like this could be being spread asymptomatically, and so therefore I would do the following things. So you have these two kinds of basic, I would say, rhetorical tropes going on. One is, let's rely on the public health information experts and just repeat what they say. And the other is questioning sort of the authority of them. At a larger level, and this is particularly evident here in the United States, Simon, I don't think you are experiencing quite what the American people are experiencing. You have the ultimate authority in times of national crisis, the President of the United States, who gives statements that indicate that there is, there's nothing to worry about, that this is under control, that, we've got this handled, that this is not dangerous, so on and so forth. And contrary to that, you have the visual rhetoric. And I would say, the equivalent of President Hoover saying prosperity is just around the corner, and then we all visualize in our minds, stockbrokers going through their tape and jumping out the window. We're experiencing one of those moments right now, because anyone in America who has a cell phone has received photographs from friends who are in shopping markets and the shelves are empty, and there's this profound visual rhetoric of what we're hearing rhetorically from the leaders is not the reality on the ground, that we're getting two different rhetorical sort of punches. And, you could argue that seeing the stock market crash is equivalent. I would suggest that those of us with more than 10 years experience have seen the stock market go up and down before. And so that's personally alarming, but not as frightening. But most of us have never experienced empty shelves before. Most of us have never walked into a store before and seen it wiped out, which is why everyone then takes a picture and sends it to you. So, one of the great challenges going forward, and as I said, this is the fourth public health pandemic that we've experienced just in the 21st century. One of the challenges going forward is going to have to be learning to manage not only the spoken delivered message, but also, and here's the internet doing what public officials can't do. It's delivering a very profoundly different message to people. And of course, as Roosevelt famously said, that the only thing we need to fear is fear itself. Well, one of the realities of health emergencies as opposed to wars is the tendency to sow absolute fear and panic. Wars do that as well, but there's something, if you look at, for instance, the polio outbreak in the 1950s, which they knew came in the summertime and they knew affected boys more than girls. It had the double whammy of it disproportionately, almost exclusively affected children, and those, some died and others were left horribly crippled, and there's images of iron lungs and everything. And so, you had a similar sense of panic at the time, with swimming pools and, movie houses and everything closing down, and parents grabbing their kids and making them stay in the house, and not knowing what they can do. This is a sort of a recurring issue when you get to, public health emergencies. But there's one that I talk about that I think is an interesting one to sort of contrast with what we're going through now, and that was not long after the end of the Second World War. A traveling businessman went down to Mexico City and came back to New York and went into the hospital and was misdiagnosed. It was not recognized that he had smallpox. And then he subsequently died, and and two other people died as well. So there was a minor outbreak of smallpox in New York City in 1947. And this is right after the war. And so you have a different atmosphere defined by a trust in government, an expectation that the government can lead us out of any problem, a trust in science, and a willingness to sort of stand in line and sacrifice. So it is really a heroic story in the history of public health. Within a week, they had vaccinated 500,000 New Yorkers, and within a month, they vaccinated 6 million New Yorkers. People stood in lines in rainstorms to wait to get vaccinated. And historically, smallpox is one of the most fear-inducing of all diseases because, as you know, not only is it lethal and it's highly virulent, but it also, for the survivors, often leaves you horribly disfigured and pockmarked, and it is just a terrible, terrible disease. But there you had an example, and I think it speaks to the difference in times of authorities saying what the message should be and the population listening to what authorities said and sort of following along and doing exactly as they were told. And I'm sorry, Simon, I was not watching my time. I'm trying to balance these things, but I'm looking through my notes, and I wanted to say that the World Health Organization has studied this idea of how do we communicate during public health emergencies, especially global pandemics, because you end up with profoundly different cultures and you can't create one simple message that transmits and is understood and followed all the way around the world. But there's some certain basic ideas that have come from their research and experience that, the key element here is trust, that you must establish trust. You must have trust in the people who are speaking. This is obviously an issue in the United States right now, as I spoke about the difference between what's being said at the top and what is visually coming through on everyone's phones from their neighbors. The second point that the World Health Organization makes is that, you must announce early. You must get on it right away. The third is that there must be transparency. Their fourth criteria is listening, which is an interesting aspect of this whole communications thing. And then the fifth is planning, which is clearly something that is going to need to have more attention in the future, because I think we can safely presume that when we emerge from coronavirus, we will not therefore be free of future public health emergencies. So it's a great time to be, from a communicator's point of view, and from the idea of speeches and rhetoric, it's a great time to be watching to see steps and missteps. I will not claim to be a public health expert, but just as an observer of someone who works with communications and works in a major medical center, a hospital, I would give us no more here in this country, no better than a C- at the best at this point. I think we're bumbling the response, and I think what is particularly frightening for people is there seems to be a sense of, not only do we not know exactly what to tell people or what to do, we've never even really thought about this before, which is not true. The case exists that, famously, when the current administration came in, they eliminated the Global Pandemic Office in the White House. But there has been actually a fair amount of work done on this. What I think we are seeing is, first of all, a resistance to the idea. And second of all, perhaps a failure of imagination. And that brings me back to one last point that I make. I'm sorry, I'm beginning to ramble a little bit.
Not in the least.
One of the if you compare what we're experiencing now with the 1918 pandemic, you see, some frightening parallels. I live in Baltimore, but I actually work in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia and Baltimore both had similar experiences. They had public health commissioners who were very resistant to the idea that the influenza was going to cause a real public health trouble. They didn't really want to hear that news because of the fact that that would require them to do some very unpopular things like close down public meetings and, shut businesses and things that were really disruptive. So they resisted doing it. Now, in Baltimore, it played out that we sort of got by with it, and our death rate here was actually lower than average. In Philadelphia, the Navy Yard brought a ship in. And remember, it's at the very end of World War I, and a ship arrived reporting influenza on board. And on the first day, when the ship was berthed, on the first day, 2 sailors died. On the second day, 14 sailors died, and then it followed the sort of progression that great pandemics do. And the public health commissioner specifically refused to cancel a parade that was to be held that day, and it was to sell Liberty bonds to help finance the war. So the ship arrived, influenza was confirmed in the city. They were having mounting deaths. The public health commissioners assured people that this was really only a problem for the armed forces, that it was not really a threat to civilian populations. They went forward with the parade, and 200,000 Philadelphians came out to witness this parade. And from there, the city was probably the hardest hit urban area in the United States. And the stories are, suitably horrific of, bodies being left out on the front porch and people dropping dead left and right, and then mass graves and the whole sorts of things that kind of thing happens. The most effective public health communications tend to find assertive statements that give the listener a sense of control, a sense of some certainty in dealing with the issue. So when Philadelphia finally sort of got its act together and started responding to the crisis, there was a mistaken belief at the time that spitting on the street, which I think in the beginning of the 20th century was just socially much more common than what we have come to expect. But there was a belief that the flu was being spread that way. So within a fortnight, signs that said "spit spreads death" appeared on every streetcar and on every they were plastered across the city, and this was sort of the response. Not in a particularly effective public health response, but I think it shows the right approach. And I think in our own lives, what we have seen and what we're seeing today, if you think about it, there have been several very, smoking kills, cover your cough. One, I don't know, Simon, if this translates, but here in America, we say stop, drop, and roll. Do you know what that refers to?
No.
If you're on fire. But most Americans know this: stop, drop, and roll. This is what you do if you're on fire. You want to stop, drop, and roll. Well, we're seeing the rhetorical equivalent right now, which is blown up on Twitter, and it's flatten the curve. Flatten the curve. I think probably most of you have seen that, which is the only reasonable response at this time is we want to prevent the capacity of the health system from being overwhelmed.
Yes.
And to do that, what we need to do is just, we can't, probably 75 to 80% of us will contract the illness at one point, but we don't want a typical, epidemic straight up and straight down. We want to flatten the curve so we don't overwhelm the health system. That's why Italy's on lockdown. That's why countries are going into lockdown to prevent this. The flatten the curve was a CDC graphic that was done about 10 years ago, and it's really worth interesting to read. A designer got hold of it and had the idea to these two curves. I'm just going to add arbitrarily a line that says health system capacity and put that in. And then a health expert in New Zealand turned it into a graphic that moves. So now what you'll find on Twitter and has been broadcast all around the world is someone down below, a man, is saying, oh, it's just a common cold. There's no real issue to worry. And you see the typical epidemic curve. And then you see a woman saying, I'm staying home, I'm washing my hands, I'm doing all these other things. And then you see the flattened curve and with the line across that represents the healthcare capacity of hospitals not to become overwhelmed. You know, rhetorically, it's very powerful. It's a very strong, easy to understand message. And just in my own experience, you know, here in America, I work at a major research, I work at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. We're Ivy League major research university. We were very early in announcing that we were moving to online classes. I would say the Ivy Leagues, the research universities in general, I'm not claiming special status for Penn, but just we're among the group that very early on took leadership in the issue and said, you know, we're sending our students home. We don't want you living in dorms together and eating in dining halls together. You need to get out of here. We need to start shutting things down, ramping things down. And we are now at the point where all non-essential workers are working remotely. And, you know, but it's based on the fact that we're keenly aware of that we have a hospital that has X number of respirators and X capacity, and we don't want it overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So, and I would say as a general observation, and my point there was simply that higher education has been in the sort of vacuum of leadership at the top in our country currently. Some governors have been really very good and effective and out front, and the colleges and universities were very early on to start saying, no, we need to treat this seriously. We need to deal with it. And I would particularly applaud the University of Virginia. The communications that have come out of there have been very effective and very straightforward. Jim Ryan is the president there. He's been very good at both communicating the need to, you know, our hospital is, you know, the single regional important medical center here. We cannot overload it. That's why we need everyone to leave. But then also conveying through Twitter very personal messages to the students and to others saying, I understand, you know, you're a graduating senior. You were doing research, you were in a school play, you were doing, you know, drama or playing on the field, and you're deeply disappointed. I feel your pain.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, the other aspect of dealing in these health crisis emergencies. People are afraid, people are uncertain, and we, you know, the need to communicate constantly cannot be, you know, overstressed, and that's a battle I'm in my own life. I'm fighting, you know, that there's a tendency to take and say, well, the CEO, the president shouldn't be communicating on this constantly. It's like, no, actually, this is the time that we need, you know, communications, trusted, scientifically based communications from the top. So that was my.
Fabulous, Mike. What a review of such a pressing topic and such a vital one as well. Thank you so much. There's so much insight there. You know that our own Prime Minister Boris Johnson took the words "flatten the curve" and he turned it into "squash the sombrero." I don't know.
Wow.
Squash the sombrero was his.
Just the visual of it.
Yeah. And
okay.
It's a joke, but it's an interesting take on it in a way that what he was trying to do is to give people a very simple piece of language that could work.
Right.
And it comes to the heart of this complexity populism chasm, that you have a very, very complex issue, public health.
Yeah.
And you need to be able to communicate that across the entirety of society, because the entirety of society is affected. So I just wondered if you have any other kind of insight into how you bridge that gap between complexity and populism?
You know, in the ideal world, we get everyone on the same page, first of all. I mean, what we're experiencing here is different political leaders having, even within, say, you know, the Republican Party is politically dominant at this moment in our country's history. And even within the Republican Party, you have some noted leaders saying, no, we need to treat this seriously. People pay attention. And others saying, go out to dinner. It's a great time, you know, to support your local restaurant, because the most important thing is not to tank the economy. So a consistency of message is clearly not being seen here, and,
right.
and you know, we're going to pay the price in the short and long term for that. I think what Flatten the Curve does brilliantly, as Squash the Sombrero does brilliantly, is it not only gives a fairly straightforward and direct and simple, you know, instruction, but it gives audiences agency. It's something I can do.
Yes.
And that's the, you know, and it's sort of like, I think I have read that collecting all the tin cans and garden gates in Britain during the war actually did very little for the war effort, but it gave people some you know, some moment of agency, something they were doing something. And human beings need a sense of contributing, especially at a time of grave crisis. So I think, you know, rhetorically, anything that gives people the ability to feel that they can do something is incredibly useful.
Great, Mike. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that, and I'm sure lots of people will have done, and it was a fascinating review. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simon.
Great, and a lovely way to celebrate World Speech Day with such a topical review.
And Gideon, I asked you, Gideon, I typed in a question. If at some point you can share where the Audible of the speeches is, I would love to find that source. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to hand over to Spiros, who's in Athens. I'm going to unlock Spiros. Hang on a minute.
Hello. Hello.
Oh, wonderful, Spiros. Thank you very much for joining us, Spiros. Great pleasure. Spiros Malios, who teaches rhetoric in schools in Athens. And it'll be, as a way of closing off, I think it's really fun to have someone who's sort of involved in day-to-day teaching of rhetoric to young people to kind of give us a flavor of how you go about it and why it's important. And no better place to comment from than Athens, and the city which personally I love. So it's a great pleasure to have you here with us, Spiros.
It's very nice to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Lovely.
I live in Athens, so I teach rhetoric to school children from the age of 12 to 16. And it has been an experiment, but it's very important for those kids because they have the opportunity to acquire a skill that it is not usually included in teaching. Like me, a lot of children or young students may be competent in writing like I was, and I could get good marks in school and university. But when I graduated from the university, it was very difficult for me to present myself in interviews, or I was very shy. So although I was better than some other people in actual skills, like hard skills, I couldn't compete with them in soft skills. So I started practice because I was not very good in speaking. And because I was not very good, I had to try harder than others. So after 3 or 4 years, I became a decent speaker. But meanwhile, I had acquired a lot of material, a lot of teaching materials that I have used for myself. So I proposed to a private school in Athens to include rhetoric as a subject. And because there are very few people who teach it, I had the opportunity to teach it here. So now it's the 5th year. And it has been a wonderful experience. We meet once a week with each group. So usually I show the students a speech, usually from TEDx or another instance, so they can see how a professional speaker talks or like a speaker talks in front of an audience, in order to familiarize themselves with the process, because a lot of people, young and older, they are very skillful talking among a few people. They seem very competent in this small group, but when they have to speak in front of a large audience, like 100 people or 200 people, they become very nervous. So the first thing is to familiarize ourselves with the audience, because every time you speak, you think of yourself like giving an exam, because there are 200 people looking at you. So a small mistake that one listener could surpass, 1 out of 200 would certainly point it. So you become very nervous. So we teach children to be well prepared, because a good speech starts before you come in front of an audience. So you have to prepare very well. If you give a speech for about 3 minutes or 4 minutes, which seems a small period of time, but it's really difficult, you have to practice 10 hours more or less. You have to practice your introduction, you have to practice your ending, and then you have a structure of your speech. You may not follow it 100%, but at least you have to have a structure. And this is the part of the preparation that you have to make sure it is very good. Secondly, it's the part that you speak. You have to speak in front of an audience. Maybe in school you speak in front of your classmates, but nevertheless it's quite demanding. So at the first lessons, I don't correct the students. I just want them to have the opportunity to familiarize themselves, and then step by step, after the first 3-4 lessons, I make some small suggestions, like how is the opening better to be, or how they better stand in front of the audience, and small things that help young students better themselves in this respect. So what my experience so far is that a lot of young students have an opportunity to become good speakers. They have the opportunity to participate in competitions once or twice a year, and this is a very good component of an education. And a lot of children come year after year to the class because they want to improve themselves more. And this is something very important for me, because it's an opportunity to help others to acquire a skill that they wouldn't otherwise. And also, to finish, I think this is a very important opportunity for some students that face difficulties in writing, so they cannot express themselves in written words, like they have some form of dyslexia, or they are not good in class and they don't have much confidence. So they have an opportunity to participate in something that you don't have to be good in writing or reading. And this gives them more courage for other classes as well. So this is from me, just a small introduction. And in Greece, in the last 10 years, teaching rhetoric has become very popular. A lot of schools have included it, and a lot of adults as well want to improve themselves, mostly for professional reasons, because they need it in work, but also for improving yourself. So I'm really happy that here in Greece, at least, among other problems, we have some improvement in this area, so we can teach others, and we can be taught from others to become better. So thank you very much again for inviting me. Any questions you have, I may answer.
Yes, thank you, Spiros. It sounds from your own story and from the experience you have with your pupils, there's a sort of understanding that speaking and public speaking is a way to change yourself, to give yourself new opportunities. That it's potentially quite a simple skill to learn, but it can be quite transformational. Is that your experience?
Yes, young children are easier to learn to talk because it's more normal for them. But as you go through school year after year, your success depends on how well you write and read. So you don't spend much time in speaking, and you are not evaluated in speaking. So a lot of people like me, we had to specialize in reading a lot and writing a lot, become better at expressing yourself, solving problems, but you are not taught how to speak, which
Yes.
would be much easier if you learn from a young age, because young children deliver very well speeches, very good speeches.
Yes. Yes, it's interesting that actually one of the skill which probably will define you in later life is public speaking, not being able to write, and certainly not now if you've got Grammarly to do all the work for you.
Yeah.
Yes, people who can speak well are people who other people admire, and they have more opportunities socially and professionally.
Yes.
So it's not only your formal skills, but also if another person can trust you, or if he thinks you are well-rounded, you have a lot of small details in your personality that you can do small things with, because sometimes we focus on degrees, we earn one degree after another, and we lack some very basic skills that people need to have in order to cooperate and work. Because school, at least in Greece, but also in other countries, doesn't prepare you much for professional life. It prepares you for academic life, more or less, how to read, how to solve problems to a very high degree. Because in Greece, students who are 15 or 16 or 17, they have to go through some mathematics books who are very advanced, very advanced, which include a lot of university level material, physics as well, and so this is how we evaluate students. So I always tell my students that in addition to those skills, they have to keep their soft skills, to be able to communicate with others, to be able to be patient, to be able to be trustworthy. So those are the skills that make a lot of people succeed professionally, but we don't teach them.
Exactly, and also it's also has an effect on one's personality. Do you think that if you can speak in public, you feel differently about yourself?
Of course, when people look at you, you feel important. You feel that you feel like what you have to say, there are people who are willing to listen. So the better you speak, more people want to listen to you, the more important you think what you do is, the more your self-esteem is higher. So it beside any professional gains, also it has some psychological gains to feel better for yourself if you do something that you consider important, and if you have the opportunity to spend time with other people.
Yes. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Spiros. I think we've come to the end of our slot this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
I've personally enjoyed the whole event hugely, and I've enjoyed the kind of variety and panorama that we've had on public speaking, and the expertise and the knowledge and the understanding and the generosity to share that has been lovely. So thank you all, and it's been a wonderful experience on Rhetoric for World Speech Day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simon.
Thanks.
See you.
See you soon.
See you.
Bye, Spiros.
Goodbye.